All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's live webinar entitled Decentralized Clinical Trials and Digital Health, Navigating the Opportunities and Channels of Recent FDA Guidance. Today's session is brought to you by Astrix and presented by Jamie O'Keefe, who I will introduce in just a moment. Before I do that, I want to take a moment and tell you a little bit about who Astrix is. We'll give you a quick company snapshot and talk a little bit about the different types of services that we engage with our customers. We are a professional services and consulting firm, have been for over 25 years. We were established in 1995. When we say we're vendor and platform agnostic, we go back one sec, Jamie. When we say we're vendor and platform agnostic, what we mean is we work with lots of different technologies in the industry. We don't align ourselves with any one or two. We try to work with customers to pick, kind of the best solutions based on what we learn about them. We have 1,200 employees, greater than 90% of which hold advanced science degrees. So we are very much a science-based company who helps science-based companies with locations in the US and overseas. Who we help? Everybody from startups to Fortune 1000. We don't have a limit on size of companies that we work with. We work in the life science enterprise, chemical, CPG, government agencies, research institutions. Generally speaking, if you have an R&D, a division of your company, we're a company that can help you. The type of services that we help with, and we go to the next slide, are going to be listed here. It's an end-to-end service offering. We like to say we accelerate digital transformation and optimize performance across your ecosystem. Not to go through these ad nauseum, you'll be able to see these in the follow-up, but basically everything from strategic innovation, enterprise architecture, that's oftentimes helping companies figure out what they need to accomplish whatever goals they might have. From there, we can help them select different solutions to meet those needs. That could be everything from us helping you pick technology through RFP development. Then we can also help with the development and implementation of those systems. We can do computer systems validation when those systems are installed and provide ongoing application support. We even go as far, and something that's kind of unique about Astrix, we have a full staffing division, so we can staff both IT as well as scientific personnel in your lab or in your clinical research department. So that's just a little bit about the services. I'll take a moment and introduce our speaker for today. Jamie O'Keefe is the head of clinical and regulatory here at Astrix. He leads that practice, managing implementation services in these domains, and brings over 18 years in the R&D management and IT consulting sectors with him. And he's collaborated with many of the leading pharmaceutical firms and early stage biotechs today. Jamie, I won't steal your thunder. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you. I'm going to sit back and enjoy the presentation. I'll be back on at the end to help with questions.
All right, thank you very much. So welcome everybody, thanks for joining today. So as we talked about, we are going to talk about the guidance that has come out from the FDA on decentralized clinical trials. So the details of that, we're going to talk about the challenges that we see with the current guidance and DCTs on a more general level, as well as the opportunities. And then we can certainly leave some time at the end for questions. So from a just background perspective, right, the guidance information is listed here. So the formal paper that was put out is the Decentralized Clinical Trials for Drugs, Biological Products and Devices. The draft guidance was put out in May of 2023. There was a open comments period where there were 92 comments that were submitted. And the deadline and closure of the comments period was August 1st of 2023. So if you would like to go get a copy of the draft guidance document, I've included the link here. I did want to talk briefly on and kind of highlight the definition as the FDA has put it in this draft guidance of decentralized clinical trials, because like many things in the pharmaceutical industries, and particularly in clinical, everybody has a slightly different definition. So as quoted from the guidance document, what they consider a decentralized clinical trial is a clinical trial where some or all of the trial-related activities occur at locations other than the traditional clinical trial sites. And this is interesting to me and important to me from a couple of standpoints. The biggest one being people tend to be kind of bucketing a whole bunch of different activities under the moniker of DCT, right? I hear a lot from my sponsor clients and from webinars and conferences and things like that, remote monitoring, remote site monitoring and things like that is DCT, and using, technologies to gather data from the sites is DCT. I mean, if you take this strict definition that the FDA has put forth, this is literally just we are going to conduct activities related to the conduct of the clinical trial in more places and in more ways than have historically been done, which is usually, right, they're brought into a central site or potentially maybe to a lab for pulling samples, but generally it's a single place where they go for all activities related to that. So from an overview, the draft guidelines covered quite a lot of ground, I have to say. So these are the high-level areas that they covered, right? So a big area was design considerations, right? So what do you need to think about from a protocol design standpoint when looking for a DCT? They covered the conduct of remote clinical trial visits and clinical trial related activities. So if you are doing things like telehealth and things like that with the subjects. They also covered the use of digital health technologies. So how can you, instead of doing an actual visit, use things like eCOA and other tools that the subject can do on their own to acquire the information and data that's used in a clinical study. Roles and responsibilities of both the sponsor and the investigators when you are doing a decentralized trial were covered. And there was a specific call out for how do you obtain informed consent and oversight from an IRB of that informed consent process when it's a decentralized trial. Other areas that were covered was determining the appropriateness of investigational product, like what depending on the type of product, is it appropriate to do that in a decentralized study context? And then with that, packaging and shipping, how is that handled and what's the impact of doing that if you're doing that to multiple locations? A big and important area also covered was the safety monitoring. So how do you ensure the safety of the participants if it's done in a decentralized manner? And then of course, software, right? Like, so how are you collecting and managing all of the data that's coming through from all of these different places and different devices potentially to support a DCT? So one of the biggest areas that was covered and has an impact is on the protocol design itself, because obviously this has a pretty broad impact on the way you're going to both design and oversee your studies. One of the big areas was around what are the operational aspects of a DCT that are going to be implemented. So is it going to affect scheduled visits or unscheduled visits, reporting of data, imaging? Are labs going to be performed at the site or at the patient's home or potentially at their local HCP? And then as we talked about, how is the investigational product going to be delivered? Is that going to be done centrally at the site, or will you use regional distributors? And how do you maintain the chain of custody for the investigational product? And then, of course, how do you monitor the safety across a much broader set of people that are interacting with the subjects? Another thing that you need to understand and plan for in the protocol design is what activities outlined for the study itself can effectively be done outside of a clinical site visit. So are there certain labs, are there certain procedures that make sense and can safely be handed off and delegated to a healthcare professional or a home nurse or someone else, as opposed to having them come into the central site? Looking at which trial activities have to be done by trained study personnel versus those that can be done by other personnel that are not necessarily fully trained in the study. So which research activities require detailed knowledge of the protocol and which would be considered under just general standard of care. And then on the other side, which activities don't require that training and then therefore could be handed off to non-study providers, right? To understand the level of training and control that you need for each of those activities, instead of the typical assumption, which is it's all being done by trained investigative site staff. And then you need to look at how are you going to manage your monitoring of this, your site monitoring of this, and your data monitoring of this. How does that need to change? Are there multiple locations that a site monitor potentially would have to visit for source data, things like that? And then documenting what are the methods for remote data acquisition, if that's happening, from the patients, from the trial personnel, and from those outside providers, to ensure that you have the data that you need for your study execution. There was a strong recommendation that there's a need for a robust data management plan to understand and outline and govern the data coming from multiple sources and multiple physical locations, in order to make sure that it's clear how that's being managed, when that data is coming in, and again, the chain of custody of that information. There's also a strong need to understand how you're doing your adverse event reporting and management, given again, there's a broader number of people potentially involved that could be the recipients of information that's tied to an AE or a potential AE. And then should IP be distributed more broadly than at the centralized site, right? Ensuring that the storage, handling, distribution, destruction of that IP is all managed appropriately if it's been put out to multiple areas. There's definitely a huge impact on roles and responsibilities for a study given a DCT. The role and the responsibilities of the sponsors themselves and the primary investigators, they're largely the same in here, but there are some important differences. From an investigator standpoint, they're responsible for the conduct and oversight of the study and those individuals that they may delegate to do some of those trial-related activities that are not done within the PI's area. That includes ensuring that they're done according to the plan, according to applicable regulations for clinical trials, and of course relevant local laws. Some of the key differences between DCTs and traditional clinical trials, there's a big impact from the extent to which the investigator uses telehealth with their subjects, or trial personnel working remotely, and not all being in the same physical location. And then again, as we talked about, the bringing into account local healthcare providers or digital health technologies to perform some of the activities of the study, or to acquire the information and collect the data from the subjects. And you also need to see whether or not the trial can be conducted entirely using remote visits, or more typically a hybrid design. And understanding upfront what that means based off of the kinds of assessments and the procedures that need to be done, and the way the IP is delivered to subjects and things like that, for the endpoint collection, as well as to monitor the safety of the subject. Another area that has a pretty big impact is the study documentation itself, right? So you've now got multiple places and locations and people involved in the collection and of data, as well as the conduct of the study itself. So that has an effect on where does all the study documentation reside, so that you can appropriately document the study. So the guidance was very strong and very clear on it should still be centralized, the record keeping and the documentation, for inspection purposes. So it needs to come back to a single location as much as possible, so that it's easy to inspect and demonstrate an appropriate documentation set. There's an impact from the standpoint of that you may have new documents that you wouldn't have in a traditional study. One thing to consider is you're going to have to maintain a task log of the local HCPs. So what activities are being performed and who are the HCPs that perform those? And that needs to include things like the name and the affiliation of the HCP, what is their role and their assigned tasks, the dates that each of the HCPs are actually added to the log, so when did they join the study, so to speak, and the locations of where the activities are being conducted. And as we said before, there's a strong recommendation to implement a data management plan if that's not something that's already in place per sponsor processes. And this is really recommended it because it's a way for the sponsor to account for multiple sources of data collection. It really should include information about how the data acquisition is done remotely and how do you transmit that data back centrally, and also to understand and maintain the data provenance. So, you know, from a DCT perspective and getting clarity and guidance from the FDA on how decentralized clinical trials should be executed, you know, there are quite a lot of potential opportunities here. The biggest one and the one that's most talked about currently is, you know, the ability to enhance recruitment and retention of the subjects and participants, right? The ability to bring this closer to them and make it more convenient to be a part of a clinical trial is a huge potential advantage here, right? Who wouldn't want to go to their local doctor that's well known for the regular kind of visits and procedures and sessions, as opposed to potentially, right, having to travel a half hour, an hour or more away for every single activity as part of that study. It should also come with increased trial efficiency, again, just travel standpoint, but also being able to have that information more readily available if you're using remote technologies, and also hopefully improve data quality, right? So it should be more timely. You should be able to get the information in a more real-time basis from the participants, which should improve the data and the quality of that data. And really the goal, one of the big goals here should be that this is a patient-centric approach. So how do you build out the design of your decentralized trial to make it most comfortable, most convenient, most feasible for the patients themselves, and ensure that they have a better overall experience. Eventually, there's talk of there being cost reduction from this, right? So if you can decentralize the work, hopefully that should reduce the overall cost. I would caution from this standpoint that initially there's probably more cost because there's infrastructure from a business process standpoint and documentation standpoint, and then certainly from a remote technology and data collection technology standpoint, right? Those are not necessarily things that are fully in place today. But over time, there should definitely be a cost reduction from doing a decentralized trials. And certainly across all of this, right, it's the greater flexibility that's available, right? So being able to leverage resources and capabilities that are already in place and are more convenient and local to people should give a better flexibility as far as who can be involved and recruitment standpoints, and as well as just the overall implementation of a clinical trial. Some of the challenges and concerns that are coming out, both just generally from a decentralized clinical trial, but also specifically to the guidance that was put out. One of the major potential barriers and challenges here is there sufficient and secure technology to support these? This is in kind of two major areas. The one that probably gets the most attention is when data collection is going directly to the participant, right? Is the technology easy enough? Are the apps easy enough for the participants to use and understand and therefore give the appropriate data and information into it? And then there's the just transport of the data, right? So either getting it from those devices, or if there's data collection systems that are in place at HCPs and things like that, right? Like is that data being managed appropriately and managed securely and then brought back in centrally for final dispositioning within the sponsors? There's definitely business process change required, right? To ensure that these factors are being accounted for in the protocol design itself. And then there is certainly business process change from a trial execution standpoint, both on the sponsor side and more importantly and more impactfully on the site side. There are some data integrity concerns around this, right? Are you potentially impacting the integrity of the data because you are now leveraging people who are not fully trained and fully knowledgeable of the study and the protocol itself? And does that affect the quality and integrity of the data as it comes in? There's also still questions and concerns from a roles and responsibilities standpoint. There are some areas that the guidance was very clear about the changes in responsibilities and roles. In other areas, it was not at all clear, and it leaves a lot of gray area as in regards to, you know, how far do you need to take things like documenting CVs and HCP certifications, and what training might those people need specifically for the study, as opposed to just accepting as an MD or an HCP that it's acceptable. So there's a lot of gray area there, and how much more responsibility does this actually put on the investigative sites as opposed to the sponsors? And as I said, you know, training and documentation requirements for the non-core HCP, as they're called, was not very well stated within the guidance itself. So what, given the strictness of those from a regulation standpoint for study personnel, how is that to be managed, right? Is there training verification? Is there baseline training that needs to be done for any HCP, things like that? And then how do you manage the documentation back from a central standpoint? And that is the substance of my presentation. So I'm happy to open it up for questions.
Great, thank you, Jamie. A couple things here real quick for the audience. For those of you that joined after, I guess, the initial section, we're going to go ahead and stop the recording. As I mentioned,